Are you seeing the right screen?
Yeah, can you share presentation mode?
Yeah, it is like it was being weird. I'm sorry.
You did for a while and then it
That
went.
now
Yeah,
it's the right one.
thank you. Okay, well, welcome to a webinar. And the idea for this webinar, just to give you a background, came from our peer impact networks. One of our peer impact networks for environmental sustainability professionals suggested that we host a webinar on reporting, sustainability reporting. And today, next slide, please. We are hosting a member, a sponsor, and the person that I know for sustainability reporting, Dr. Matthew Gardner. Matt combines his background in chemistry and environmental science with practical approach to sustainability strategy, development, precise measurement of sustainability impacts, and state-of-the-art sustainability communication. He brings a multidisciplinary approach to his work that unites technical, quantitative expertise with a commitment to clarity and pragmatism. Matt holds a PhD in chemistry, spent 10 years on the staff of MIT, and teaches sustainability strategy and entrepreneurship at the Harvard Extension School. And I will put a link in chat to his bio and contact info. Before I hand it over to Matt, I just want to point out that we have multiple events coming up if you're interested. And I'll put the link in chat. Our upcoming webinar next week is on policies supporting Granite State workers with the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. So if you're interested, go to the link and register for our upcoming events. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Matt because I know people are waiting for this topic.
Great. Well, thanks, Zena, and thanks, Michelle, Debbie. It's great to see many familiar faces and names on this webinar. Saw many of you just a few short weeks ago at the NHPSR Spring Conference, which I'll say again was really awesome. That was a great gathering of people. And you know, as Zena and I were talking about a few minutes ago, it's going to be hard to ever top Rebecca Henderson's keynote address at any future NHPSR event. You know, we will certainly try. But she was pretty awesome. So as Zena said, I'm Matt Gardner. I'm one of the partners at SustainServe. I'll talk in a minute just about SustainServe, and have been a member and a supporter of NHPSR for a number of years, and you know, and very proud to do so. It's really a wonderful organization. I think a great resource, not just for the state of New Hampshire, but for all of New England, all of the Northeast, for all things responsible business. If you're not familiar with all of the programming that NHPSR offers, I encourage you to do so, because there's a lot of really great stuff that goes on there. Just as one warning, 3 or 4 days ago, I came down with a nasty cold and cough and all that. I might mute myself, you know, once in a while to hack, but I'll try to spare you that. But anyway, let's jump right in, you know, and I'll share my screen. But you know, if you have questions, raise your hand. And I'll get to them, and I'll certainly leave some time at the end for people to ask questions. This is a complicated subject. It covers a lot of territory, geographically, topically, you know, and so there's no kind of one source of truth for all of this. So again, let me just jump in, and we'll go from there. So see if I can share my screen. All right, looks like I'm screen sharing. Let me know if you don't see it, and we'll just go from we will go from there. So landscape of ESG reporting. That's the, you know, in theory, that's what we'll talk about here today. We'll see if I do a good job on that. You know, let me know again if you have questions, and we'll have time at the end, or please feel free to follow up afterwards with any questions or things that you wanna talk about. So SustainServe, we're a ESG consultancy, 24 years old, based in Boston, where I sit with a team of about 10 people. I have an office in Nashville, an office in Zurich, Switzerland, where my other 2 co-founders sit. And then we have an office in Frankfurt. We're about 30 people globally. This is the cast of characters, the brains of the operations, the ones who really do all the work and should get all the credit for the good work that SustainServe does. We come at this from all different disciplines and, backgrounds and experience levels. It's the four partners across the top, but then as you can see, there's faces ranging from old to young in there. But again, coming at this from the hard sciences, from marketing and communications backgrounds, accounting, really you name it, and there's backgrounds there, and it speaks to the breadth of the topic, ESG, environmental social governance, and it's a strategy question, it's a data question, it's a communications question, and that's how we really think about it internally at SustainServe. Strategy, data is the center column, communications in the right-hand column. If there's a wide variety of ways that companies can and need to get involved in this topic, there's a variety of reasons why they need to do it. Whether it's investor pressure, whether it's young millennials who are wanting to work for companies with whom they share values, whether it is regulatory pressure, which I'll talk about here today, that's really raising its profile and becoming an important issue for a lot of companies, is complying with regulations both here in the US, but increasingly over in Europe. Our job as consultants is to figure out what's driving the reasons why companies are engaging in this topic and to help craft solutions to meet those needs. But again, it's usually a combination of all of the above. You can be a company where you're working with, if some of your big customers are Fortune 100 companies, they're very interested in the sustainability profile of the companies that they are doing business with. If you meet certain thresholds in either revenue or headcount, or in certain geographies, there's certain laws that are coming into play there. And that's to say nothing of just the fundamental business efficiencies and process efficiencies that you can realize by operating in a more sustainable manner. Again, for any given company, it can be any or all of the above in terms of why they're doing this. And you as sustainability practitioners within your organizations or as consultants, need to kind of understand what those reasons are, because then you can craft and, what, in my opinion, are durable, sustainable solutions there. These are just some of the, kinds of companies that we work with that are interested in this. And as you can see, they transcend all sorts of sectors, everything from large global financial institutions to telecom, to consumer electronics, to chemicals, to logistics providers, to retail companies. Every sector in my, experience is being touched by this in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes people will ask, they'll say, how is what a consumer products company like Colgate-Palmolive, how is that different than what a chemical company like Clariant might be dealing with ESG issues? And that's where the details are. That's where, longer conversations need to be had. Colgate-Palmolive may be focused really more on what their B2C customers, their consumers, are interested in, and some of the pressures that they're applying to the companies that they do business with, whereas Clariant, as a giant global chemical company, as a B2B company, is dealing with things around supply chain risk, things like that. Those are just two very simple examples, but part of the work that, again, you as practitioners, us as consultants, need to be thinking about is, how do these pressures, how do these topics under the ESG umbrella vary from company to company? So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about ESG reporting in general and just some of the trends that have happened over the years and some observations. I'll talk about some of the details that we're seeing raise their heads now that we think are important things for people to be thinking about, and then to share some lessons learned in terms of how we think about reporting there. When you think of the timeline and kind of the origins of environmental social governance reporting over the years, it's gone through quite an evolution. Just as a quick sidebar, ESG, that's one acronym to be used. As you all know, this whole space is just jam-packed with acronyms. It's really an alphabet soup there. And so in our business, we tend to use ESG mostly now, but sustainability, corporate social responsibility, they all mean the same thing ultimately. And a lot of times companies will choose to use a certain term just for legacy reasons. They just think that it's how they've talked about it. In fact, I'll show a slide in a second of just some of the terminology shifts that we've seen over the years. But when we think about the timeline, this is just the more recent timeline. I mean, there's documented instances of companies producing environmental reports as far back as the 19th century, where they've provided indications or reports, stories about the impact that they have on the environment. In those days, mostly local. There wasn't as much of a global view of those things. But in more recent years, back in 1997, and this was really in response to the Exxon Valdez disaster up in Alaska, the Global Reporting Initiative was founded. Actually founded, its genesis was in Boston. GRI as an organization now sits over in Amsterdam. But GRI in 1997, they're kind of the OG of framework in the ESG reporting space, and still going strong. A year later, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the framework for how companies can compile and calculate their greenhouse gas impacts on the world. That's when that started. Carbon Disclosure Project, a couple of years later, CDP, again, still going strong. CDP is probably the premier framework for how companies tell the story about their climate impacts, their climate risks, their climate mitigation efforts, their strategies around it. About 10 years later, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, was launched. And that was another framework where and I'll talk about the differences between, say, GRI and SASB in a second. But there is some interest for there to be apples to apples comparability between how companies in a given sector disclose pertinent information about their sustainability performance. And so SASB was formed. It's a sectorally based framework where there's a whole series of different sectors where they tell you what data points they want to have communicated as part of that. I'll come back to that. 2015, a few years later, the Sustainable Development Goals, Science-Based Targets, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, was launched. Very influential, very important, still important frameworks that are out there. The UN Sustainable Development Goals coming out of the UN was really, initially intended as a way for countries at a national level to be thinking about, talking about, quantifying their impacts on a set of goals for the planet, ultimately, for people and the planet. Science-Based Targets is a framework where, based on the Paris Accords in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, is a calculation methodology. It's to set empirical quantitative goals for greenhouse gas reductions that are consistent with the goals of the Paris Accords to limit global warming to, at the time, 1.5 degrees C. And the idea being that from the scientific community, you can calculate what the total carbon budget in the atmosphere is, and what the limit is, that if we keep the carbon CO2 levels in the atmosphere below that threshold, then we would limit warming to 1.5 degrees or lower. 1.5 degrees being the threshold above which the scientific community feels we might start to see some pretty screwy things happening, below which maybe we can avoid some of those. So if the business community, if the economic part of society can figure out how to limit their greenhouse gas emissions to keep them below that 1.5 degree threshold, then maybe we as a planet can continue to operate in a more stable, predictable, less dynamic way. Science-based targets is a hot topic. We can I can answer all kinds of questions about that, but SBTs is a very important thing for a lot of companies. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is another framework that was led by Michael Bloomberg, the former presidential candidate, the owner of Bloomberg terminals, that you see in the stock exchanges everywhere. The idea there was to provide investors with information around climate-related risks that companies are facing. And the framework that they developed for TCFD, or the structure of those reports, is important and very influential. The interest with TCFD was really to provide, again, investors with information about climate-related risks, but also particularly financial risks. So can companies start to quantify what the financial exposure may be from climate change, what the risks and opportunities may be, and what they're doing to mitigate those risks or leverage those opportunities. So I was out in 2015. And then in the last couple of years, we've seen a real flurry of activity and a lot of consolidation, M&A, if you will, in the reporting space. And so I'll start with the lower one, ISSB. So ISSB is a framework, and I've got a graphic I'll show you a little bit later that shows kind of how the consolidation kind of led to this. But this is the standards board that is now becoming again a very influential framework, and in fact some countries are starting to use ISSB as a nationally mandated reporting framework for companies there. But again, it's becoming quite prominent, and I think will be factoring very significantly into corporate ESG reporting in the coming years. And then lastly, CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This is a law in the European Union that was launched at the beginning of last year, where they are mandating that companies above a certain threshold in size, revenue, balance sheet, start to talk about their sustainability impacts in the context of risks and opportunities, likelihood, severity, and providing that information in an assurable way back to their, the financial markets are really the target audience, but this is really a very broad brush legislation that is sweeping up a lot of companies, also companies here in the US there. And so over the years, we're just seeing this steady drumbeat of standards, consolidation of standards, increasing sophistication of standards for how companies are thinking about, talking about, and ultimately, performing against various sustainability objectives there. From 2011 up to 2020, for this data set, we just see the increase in the number of companies. This is the Standard & Poor's 500, the S&P 500 reporters who are doing some form of sustainability reporting. And you can see back 15 years ago, those reporters were fewer and far between than they are now. Where now you see, almost all of companies at the top of any of these indices are reporting against various things. And that's due to the pressures that I talked about earlier. That's due to investor pressure being very prominent. That's due to customer pressure, workforce expectations of customers, expectations of employees, and also just the inherent efficiencies or the opportunities that performing in a more sustainable manner may represent. But this is just, a reporting data set, and so you're seeing well over 90% of companies, of the largest companies are in fact providing some level of public disclosure about their sustainability performance there. My team a year ago, we did this as part of a client project, was just looking at, what words, what terminology are people using to talk about their sustainability reports there. And this is from the Fortune 100. And what you can see that sustainability itself is the most prominent word when companies are characterizing their efforts under the ESG umbrella. ESG is a term: responsibility, social, environmental progress, governance, people. It's just a useful thing. A lot of times companies will come to us and just say, what should we call our report? And our answer typically is, well, what would you like to call it? There's really no right or wrong answer. And again, companies will tend to call their report something because it's what their board likes, it's what their management team likes, it's what they've called it forever. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. One question we get a lot these days is whether companies are starting to back off of the term ESG because of the politicization of that term. And my answer is a careful yes. We've seen a few companies who are kind of becoming more cautious with using the term ESG, similar to the term DEI. Generally speaking, though, I would argue that I think most companies, they're in it. They're in this space. They're doing this stuff because they know it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing for them, for their stakeholders, for their investors, for their employees, and they're tending not to really want to back off of that. And we're not seeing a wholesale retreat from this. We operate here at SustainServe. We operate, up in the Northeast. Our clients are global. Our clients are spread across the U.S., including in some parts of the country where, the politicization of ESG is quite strong. And we're seeing a lot of companies just continue to do what they're doing and to call it what they're calling it without any real retreat from that. We'll see how that trend goes over time. Things ebb and flow with whatever party is in charge of whatever branch of government in Washington or in the state houses across the country. But generally speaking, we're not seeing a wholesale shift in any significant direction based on the politics of the terms these days. So when we're thinking about reporting, reporting is an exercise that companies are undertaking to tell their story, about their efforts and their performance against them. But really, let's think through what the different goals are of putting together, communicating an ESG report. One of them is to convey quantitative information, is to talk about your performance, financial reporting. It's how are we doing financially in a given quarter, in a given half year, in a year. And you can think about ESG reporting in a similar way. You want to be talking about, what are the trends in terms of our energy usage, our greenhouse gas emissions, the diversity of our management teams, our health and safety performance, how many suppliers are we engaging with on particular topics, things like that. So quantitative information is one important piece of the puzzle. I always like to argue, and I think people would agree, that quantitative information is great, but the quantitative information also really needs contextual stories. Why is the data trending in the direction that it's trending? And so I always encourage companies to provide at least some context for the data that they're providing. Can you do an ESG report? Can you communicate about your ESG efforts purely in a data-driven way? Absolutely, and we do that sometimes under some circumstances. Again, I would argue that I think that providing that context as to the, why this is the case, that the data is doing what it's doing, is a very important data point for the reader to be able to understand the backstory. And it's a way also, the context is also a way for you to communicate aspirations, because, if you are, planning to move your performance in some direction, if you're aspiring to reduce greenhouse gases, or to make your boardroom more diverse, or to improve health and safety in your workforce, then that needs to be communicated as well. It gives the reader the opportunity to put your quantitative information and the stories about why they've been driven in the direction they are. It puts it in context. It helps people understand what your goals are, what your end game is, if there is an end game. So performance against goals. If you've set a goal of reducing your greenhouse gases by 50% over 10 years, how are you doing in that sense? What are the trends of the data that you've shown? What are the impacts of the activities, the efforts, the initiatives that you've put in place? How are they contributing to your performance against goals? So these are 4 kind of really important and kind of long lasting, they've been around for a while, reasons as to why companies are, provide and produce ESG reports. But there's other goals, there's other objectives, there's other data, in pieces of information that are increasingly important for companies to be communicating. One is to be thinking about this in the context of risks and opportunities. So what are the risks that are out there? The risks in terms of if you're going to hit your goals or not. What are the risks to the business that something like climate change or water scarcity or or global health issues or whatever it is? What are those risks and maybe opportunities as well that are out there that your reader needs to be aware of? And so we always like to coach companies when they're doing ESG reporting of whatever flavor, whatever framework, to be discussing the risks and opportunities that they've identified. Sometimes these risks and opportunities are things that have been identified in the course of a standard corporate enterprise risk management process, which is great. And for those companies that are considering ESG related issues as part of their enterprise risk management process, that's really super. Some companies are doing kind of standalone efforts around climate risk assessment, for example, as part of producing their first TCFD report. But in either case, talking about the risks and opportunities that are there for the business is really helpful. Similarly, we like to see, for those companies who are in the innovation business, where you are helping to create new ways of doing your business, delivering value to your customers. We think that's another important, let's say, leading indicator of where you might be headed in the future. So if you've got aspirations, if you've got goals there, part of your way to achieve that could be through the innovation process that you have. One example of that is a client of mine here in the Boston area. They're a global manufacturer of scientific instrumentation, and they are under consistent pressure from customers. Their customers are some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. They're under pressure to be telling the story about how, or of improving, the energy efficiency of the instruments, the machinery that they produce, so that then their customers are then using less energy in the course of doing their business. And so by telling an innovation story, you can really paint a picture of what steps you're taking in order to help your customers achieve their sustainability goals. And when thinking about it, again, a sidebar, in terms of the customer supplier relationship, one of the most effective questions that if you have a customer asking you for sustainability information, or who's clearly interested in that, one of the best questions you can ask in terms of relationship building with them is to ask them, how can we help you achieve your sustainability goals, as a conversation starter, as a way to let them know that you're interested, you're aware of their goals, you're aware that they are very interested in the sustainability performance of their business, and that you may be a willing partner in this. And sometimes you can find some really interesting partnerships, collaborations that can develop as a result. But the innovation thread is something that I really like to see in sustainability reports, again, because it gives the reader an indication of where you might be going and what you're investing in and how you might get there. Increasingly, regulatory compliance, and I'll spend some time on this in a few minutes. We're seeing just an increase in regulations here in the US as well as around the world, for companies they're being mandated to disclose information about, where they have it, about their sustainability performance. And it's getting to a point where, companies are really taking this seriously. You got to do it. They're realizing that they need to invest some resources, some bandwidth in staying in compliance with these. I'll talk through a couple of them in a few minutes. Lastly, really, I think one of the foundation for all of this is really that, telling the story of how good sustainability management, good sustainability performance supports long-term value creation. Companies are in the business of making money. They're in the business of staying in business over the long term. I mean, really, that's the definition of a sustainable business, is one who is positioned to be around for a long time. And by talking about how focusing on environmental, social, and governance related issues in a targeted way, in a strategic way, how focusing on those issues can support your long-term sustainability, your long-term value creation, is very important. How does this connect to your business model? How does this make you a better company? Is a very strong message to be including in any ESG reporting that you do. So I encourage you all, as you're thinking about ESG reports for you, for your clients, or whoever, think about that value creation story. Really work with your management teams, your clients, to help them think through what this, how effectively engaging in this topic and how effectively managing these topics can support long-term value creation. So with all that, let's get into the alphabet soup. And it is an extensive one. It is very nuanced, competitive, dynamic, evolving, all of the above. So I'm just going to go through a few of the frameworks that I see as being really kind of essential or kind of core parts of the conversation right now, and to give you some commentary on them, give you a sense of where things are evolving to, and then we'll go from there. At that point, what I'll do is, after the frameworks, I'll pause and we can just have a few minutes of discussion, and then I'll give you some thoughts based on that. So frameworks, the granddaddy of them all, GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, founded in Boston in 1997, came out of Ceres. I think most of you are familiar with Ceres. It used to be called the Coalition of Environmentally Responsible Economies, but now it's just called Ceres. But GRI is now headquartered in Amsterdam. It's an organization in Amsterdam. I was in Europe with my family last summer, and I They had no idea why I made them do this, but I made them walk by the front door of Amsterdam, of GRI in Amsterdam, just for kicks. Was not a highlight of the vacation. It was for me. The mission of GRI: make sustainability reporting standard practice by providing guidance and support to organizations. This was one of the first structured frameworks outlining, prescribing how companies can figure out what topics under the umbrella of environmental, social, governance, what topics are the most relevant, are the ones that you should focus on. And then provided guidelines for if something is important, if something is material, then what should be disclosed under that given topic. The key elements of GRI reporting, and when I say like a GRI report, the way that these frameworks work typically is that you will produce a sustainability report. You'll align with the framework. You'll comply with the standard. You'll have and all of these are fairly prescriptive in terms of what they expect. There may be an index at the back of the report that outlines the GRI elements or the SASB elements that are required under that. And then you provide the disclosures, you provide the various data points that they're asking. So you have a report that's aligned with or complies with the GRI framework. And so the way that GRI is organized, they have principles of reporting, which is kind of their standard topics of how you should think about what data to include, things like that. They have so-called profile disclosures, which are boilerplate information about the company. And so they want you to talk about, what is the business, who is the business, where are you headquartered, what sector are you in, what kinds of products do you produce, how many employees do you have, things like that. So standard kind of boilerplate stuff. How many people are on your board, things like that. Then what you have is you have what are called disclosures on management approaches. And these are important. So I talk a lot about the concept of material issues, and this bullet point below, self-determined material issues. What GRI says is that a company should go through a process where it itself defines what are the relevant topics for the business based on certain criteria. What are the relevant topics for the business? In the case of GRI, it's based on what do your stakeholders care about? Stakeholders being internal or external stakeholders. What do your stakeholders care about? And then the other dimension of this is, and it's evolved over the years, but it used to be, what is most important to the business? It's now, you can now think about as, where are your impacts significant in the world? Again, and I've got a slide on materiality a little bit later in terms of in the how-to section. But basically, the company self-determines with input from stakeholders, internal and external, and tells GRI and says, these are the issues that are important. And so we're then going to focus our reporting and our disclosures around those material topics. The idea being that if a topic is deemed material, and I think this is a very important concept in the world of ESG practice, the idea is that if a topic is material, if you've deemed it important, then in theory, you should be managing it, right? You should be putting the pieces in place, be it policies, be it roles and responsibilities, accountability. You should be paying attention to it. You need to be actively managing it. What GRI asks for is for companies to disclose for those topics deemed material, how are you managing them? What are your management approaches to these topics? And you include that as part of your reporting. So if you say energy usage and climate change, let's just say, is an important topic, great. How are you managing it? Who's in charge? How do you monitor performance? How do you, what do you do if performance is going in a direction that you didn't expect it to? How do you set goals? How does this roll up to the board? They want some detail that says, hey, you've deemed this material, so how are you managing it? So that the reader can get a sense that, if you've called it important, then we want to know that you're managing it, and the reader gets a sense of how you're doing it. That's the idea there. The other interesting thing that GRI has, introduced is to focus not just on the four walls of the company, to not just focus on my property, my facilities and all that, but they really want you to look upstream and downstream in your value chain. So it's possible that there could be an issue that is very material to a supplier and thus could impact your business if something goes sideways with respect to that issue. And therefore, it might become important to you, even though it's not directly impacting you. It's something where, again, if you're if you're a company, like a large food products company, General Mills, let's just say, and I'm just making this up. Let's say you're General Mills, and then you're maybe not directly growing stuff, but you're buying stuff that someone else grows for you. Therefore, climate change could be really super important to you because that could impact your supply chain, the availability and price and quality of product, or of raw materials that you need to manufacture products. So you need to focus on that. And so they want you to, GRI prescribes that you really consider upstream and downstream impacts in your value chain, right? As part of determining material issues, as part of managing material issues, and as part of disclosing information about material issues. So GRI was really kind of one of the seminal foundational frameworks out there. And I think they're due a lot of credit for that. As some time went on, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, came out. And this was in response to kind of a recognition that in GRI's case, as I said, companies could define their own material issues. They could, so you could have cases where two different chemical companies might have two fairly different sets of material issues. And therefore, if you're an investor and you're looking at that, and these two different companies, each of which you're considering investing in, they may be reporting out on very different things. And therefore, it's hard then for you to be making an apples to apples comparison to really be saying, okay, who's performing better? Which one do I want to choose to invest in? And so the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board was put together where there was basically there are sectoral standards. So if you're a chemical company, then there is a set of disclosures that you are expected to make. If you're in the software business, there's a set of disclosures that you're expected to make. And therefore, if you're looking at two software companies side by side, in theory, you can then be looking at similar information. And in fact, this table here on the right-hand side is one page, one screenshot of the disclosure standards for someone in the software business. And so you can see they talk about environmental footprint of hardware infrastructure. They talk about data privacy and freedom of expression. They talk about data security. They talk about a diverse workforce. And so the expectation then is if you're a software company, you'll provide, some level of disclosures, and you can see what they expect here, in this accounting metric column there for each of these different topics. Some of the challenges that this introduced, though, is that, it's not all the material issues concept. It's not always a one-size-fits-all thing, where there's reasons why two different software companies may have something like, just hypothetically, data security just might not be as relevant to one as it is to another. There could be things that just aren't as relevant. So you start to see some of this, the apples to apples comparisons being sometimes more difficult, even amongst companies that are in the same sector. What we often, some companies are still reporting against SASB. This last bullet point, I'll talk about that in a second. But what we sometimes will ask them to do, or we'll counsel them to do, is to go through and do a materiality process, a la what GRI had in mind. Go through and kind of with a blank sheet of paper say, what are the important topics? What are the important topics to stakeholders? Where your impacts are greatest? To impact on your business performance, and use that to augment what SASB prescribes, and so you can have kind of a SASB plus approach. And we found that to be pretty effective. It kind of gives companies the opportunity to, design kind of, a more bespoke set of material topics or disclosure framework, but while keeping SASB at the core of what they did. And that was pretty interesting. All that being said, SASB is pretty much no longer, or no more. It's being folded into the ISSB, the Sustainability Standards Board work that's done. And again, I'll show you this evolution of these standards and where they're all headed in a second. But SASB is being folded into that. So companies will still report out using the SASB framework, but that's really being morphed into what ISSB is doing these days. And so you'll see, an ISSB is coming out, will come out with sector-specific guidelines, a la SASB. So we're going to see more and more of that moving forward. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, founded in 2015. The idea, as I mentioned earlier, is to provide financially relevant information to financial markets. And it introduced a structure where it said, when we're talking about, in the case of TCFD, when we're talking about climate, we want to talk about governance, strategy, risks, metrics. So how do you govern climate risks or climate change? What's their strategy for climate change? What are the risks and opportunities that it represents? And what are the metrics that indicate our performance there? And this structure, governance, strategy, risk, metrics, is you're going to see it's going to be carrying through moving forward into a lot of new frameworks that are really important. And so keep that in mind. TCFD, if you go to the TCFD website, there's a nice little announcement that says TCFD is no more. Because of the launch of ISSB, our work is done. And so TCFD is kind of closed up shop because ISSB has come into existence. And ISSB is a product of the IFRS, here, acronyms. But this is an international organization around around financial reporting. ISSB is using financial materiality as the guide for what's important. Therefore, it's clear that this is a product and the motivation of the financial industry. They, what they want is they want companies to be looking at what are material topics based on what might represent a material financial risk or opportunity to the business or impact on the business. They want you to then talk about those topics in the context of, back to TCFD, governance, strategy, risk, and metrics. And that's basically the deal. And so TCFD, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the SASB standards, so-called integrated reporting, which I didn't talk about, all of this has been kind of subsumed into the IFRS and subsumed into the ISSB framework. I went to a launch party for ISSB, whole bunch of the sustainability nerds of the world getting together in New York City last winter, and had this big launch, very financial markets focused, a lot of bankers in the room, getting this going. And ISSB is going to be, I think is going to be kind of one of the important frameworks moving forward. It's, divided into, this is getting into the weeds, divided into so-called S1 and S2, different sections, focused on different aspects there. And again, when you're preparing an ISSB report, that's where things like S1 and S2 become relevant. So, confused? So am I. There's a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of consolidation there. And this is just a chart, and I don't even need to explain it because it just kind of shows you the kind of the convoluted, dynamic, incestuous nature of the sustainability reporting world. It really is kind of zeroing in my opinion, on ISSB as being the standard. GRI is still hanging out there and will remain relevant as its own framework. They're playing nice here and saying that GRI complements ISSB. That's fine. Aligns with the Carbon Disclosure Project, which will continue to be an important framework for companies. TCFD is going away. You can just kind of see how this is, and it's, there's funny stories and anecdotes about back when GRI and SASB were the two frameworks that the leaders of these two organizations were on stage at a conference together, getting into some crazy argument about which one's better, and it's just kind of silly stuff like that. But I really see, GRI and ISSB kind of forming kind of the core of ESG reporting moving forward until CSRD. And this is a law out of a directive out of the European Union, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. What a directive means is that the EU in Brussels implements this, and then each of the countries in the EU then has to develop a law that reflects the directive. And that's happening literally as we speak. Companies are formulating those laws, but CSRD is in effect. So it uses what's called double materiality as the guide. So when a company is choosing what topics are material for it, there's two questions essentially. That is, what topics does the company have a significant impact on? And, so if you are as a company, where are you having an impact on people and on the environment? And there's nuanced definitions to this, but it's basically what we would call the inside out perspective. Inside the company, where are you having an impact outside of the company. That's one lens to think about when figuring out what topics do you need to talk about under the environmental, social, governance umbrella. The other lens is the outside in perspective. What topics, if not managed effectively well, strategically, may have a significant impact on the business, particularly from a financial perspective. So might climate change have a significant impact on the business? If so, then that may be a material issue for the business. And it's a very structured, detailed framework called ESRS, which CSRD is based upon. And so we're in the process here at SustainServe doing a whole lot of CSRD relevant exercises right now, helping companies come into compliance with this by doing this double materiality process. Some of the complexities or things to consider is that there's in the ESRS, in this whole framework, they ask you to consider the potential relevance of about 100 topics under the environmental, social, governance headers. And so the exercise of figuring out what you then need to talk about requires the company to go through in a very documented, assurable, for CSRD, you have to have your materiality process third-party verified or third-party assured under so-called limited assurance. But you need to go through and provide a documented process that says, here are the 10 or 15 or 20 topics that we consider to be material under the principle of double materiality. You then need to report out on those in a very structured way. And part of that reporting needs to be done as part of your financial reporting. So it's really, this is a big deal, and it's complicated, it's wide-reaching, but needs to be taken seriously. And one of the reasons that it's so important is that the way that the CSRD is written is that it's not just applicable to EU companies. The way they've written the law is that if you meet a certain threshold in terms of doing business in the EU as a foreign flag, as a non-EU company, if you meet a certain threshold of doing business in the EU, you need to also comply with CSRD. So a whole lot of global companies, not EU-based companies, US-based companies or elsewhere, if you're doing business in the EU, you got to do this as well. So we're seeing this regional rulemaking kind of sweeping up global companies and making them subject to their laws as well. And that's why it's really important. And there's a whole lot, if you go to any of the big ESG conferences these days, Green Biz, Sustainable Brands, whichever one you like to go to, there's a whole lot of talk about CSRD going on everywhere, from the big four accounting firms to boutique shops like mine to the companies who are being subject to these laws. Complicated, it's wide-ranging. Companies are needing to invest resources to comply with this, and so if you're in the value chain of large global companies, if you're doing business over in the EU, really advise you to get feedback from attorneys as to whether you might be subject to CSRD reporting. Small, medium enterprises, it's going to be a little bit easier to do it. The timeline as to when you need to be in compliance depends on how big you are. It depends on whether you're an EU company or not. There's a lot of detail here, but keep CSRD in the back of your mind just to make sure that you're aware of what its requirements are and whether you might be subject to it as a company. Then you just throw in, I almost put these in as throwaways, funnily enough. Securities and Exchange Commission came out with their finally came out with their greenhouse gas disclosure rule. California has a greenhouse gas disclosure rule. They're both, brakes are being tapped in a couple of ways. SEC is on pause pending appeals or legislation around it. But the basics of it are true, and some aspect of it may survive. A lot of this stuff is going to be required under CSRD anyway, or even at the state level. So what or in other states, there's other climate disclosure regulations being considered in various states around the country. Basically, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC greenhouse gas rule, requires companies to report out on so-called scope 1 and 2 emissions. These are greenhouse gas emissions that come from the burning of fuels or the use of electricity. California requires scopes 1, 2, and 3, which is interesting. Scope 3 are supply chain emissions, which are more complicated to calculate. They're more indirect, they're less accurate. Both require at some level and at some point in time assurance, so third-party verification of the calculations that you've done to show your reader or to show the users of this information that these these numbers are actually accurate. And then California is going to require, the way it's currently formulated, is going to require third-party assurance for your Scope 3 emissions as well. All right, so that's kind of where we stand right now in terms of all this ESG reporting. So what started off as this nice kind of, not benevolent, but this nice activity for companies to be telling their story around their efforts to be a responsible, engaged, ethical company is now really being hit with these laws, and which is really changing the landscape and changing the momentum of sustainability disclosures. I think I'll whip through the last few slides just in the interest of time, and then I want to make sure we've got a few minutes for questions at the end there. So what are just some of the lessons, some of the how-tos that we should think about when we're doing ESG reporting? First on is materiality. Materiality, again, is the foundation in my mind of a good ESG program. It's a thoughtful, strategic, organized way of thinking about the hundreds of issues that fall under the umbrella of environmental, social, governance, and distilling them down to those topics that matter most. You can ask different questions. There are different criteria that you can use to say, well, how do I determine if it's material? And these are just 4 examples. How big of an impact does this topic have on your business? Okay, you can think about it that way. How much do my stakeholders, internal or external, care about this topic? That's another lens. How much of an impact does my business have on this topic? Okay, so there's impact on the business, impact by the business. That's the inside out, outside in from CSRD. How much of an impact does this topic have on my ability to execute on my strategy, ultimately to create value over the long term? And there are other questions you can ask. These are just 4 of the ones that come out of the various frameworks I just said. But by going through a thoughtful, structured process that can include surveys and interviews and benchmarking and workshops, like workshops with management, you can boil down these hundreds of potentially relevant topics down to 10 or 12 or 8. A manageable number so that you can focus your limited time, money, resources, bandwidth, whatever, on those things that really matter. And it's super important that if you're working with a company, for a company that is getting going in the ESG space, to have some kind of process that you can talk about and think about that says, okay, what are the topics that we should really be focusing on here? Because if you're a software company working out on 128 outside of Boston, biodiversity in the Amazon rainforest, as important as it is, may not be a material issue for you. It may not be something that impacts you, that you impact it. It just might not rise to the top there. But the data security might, okay? And so you want to focus on that rather than biodiversity because you've got limited time, bandwidth, budget, resources. CSRD, as I said before, ups the game. It needs to be an auditable process where a third party, EY, PwC, whoever comes in, looks at it and says, yeah, they did this process according to the rules. So materiality is super important. Gathering data. Material issues, as we talked about, need to be monitored. So as you define your material issues, then saying, okay, what are the data points? Either leading data points or lagging data points to get into kind of the data mindset. Lagging data points are data points referring to past performance. Leading indicators are ones that are indicators of potential future performance. So what are the data points that we want to gather and where do we get them from? And how do we gather this in a quality, consistent manner? You want to define and disclose the boundaries. Are we doing just for my company, just for the 4 walls of my factory in Boston, Massachusetts, or are we including our value chain? Are we including this half-owned joint venture that in Shanghai that we're partners in? Just defining that so you know what the boundaries are of the data sets that you're collecting. You're going to always need to think about how good is the data quality, whether you have to estimate some of the data because you don't have access to it. If you have an office that shares half a floor in an office tower in New York City, you might not get actual electricity information, so you might want to estimate it. How do you do that? And then you disclose that you estimated it.
I want to leave time for a few questions if you
Great.
can before people start dropping off at 1. I will go back to the slides. Sorry for interrupting.
No, totally fine, Zena. Yeah, so why don't I hear? I'll just give you a sense of the quick thread. Storytelling is important. There's mechanics around indexes and how you structure information. This all fits into a communication strategy that you may have. There's hints for things that you should do to help make the process smoother. And then just some final thoughts. And the one I'll talk about is just ESG reporting is a snapshot in time. It is not in and of itself a program. It's a story about what you did in a time-bound period of time. So think about it that way. But you need to have actually programs to talk about in order to be able to tell the stories. So with that, I'll pause here. Love to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. Do you see any corresponding consolidation activity coming among the ESG raters? It feels crazy that we carefully completed these disclosures and still have to track, respond to, petition, and correct all the slightly different ratings and questionnaires.
Yeah, I would expect to see some consolidation, but right now, you've got ISS and MSCI and Sustainalytics and EcoVadis and just all these other platforms where these are businesses that are collecting information from companies and then giving you a score, and they then sell access to the score so that if companies want to know, how is my supply chain doing, or how are my competitors doing? Never say never. I mean, there's always going to be mergers and acquisitions, and they'll be bought up by different people. These are businesses who are in the business to make money. And part of how they do that is by trying to differentiate themselves from other, to claim that they are better than the other. For right now, I encourage companies to look at the circles of in a Venn diagram and to say, EcoVadis asks for this, ISS asks for this, Sustainalytics rates you on this. Prioritize those things that sit in the center if you're being asked to do a lot of them. And then also prioritize based on your stakeholders. If you've got one big customer who's saying, hey, your EcoVadis score stinks, we're not going to do business with you if it doesn't improve, then prioritize that improvement and tailor your stuff to what EcoVadis asks for. So it's really kind of a triangulation exercise as to which one is most important. So yeah, there'll be, there may be some mergers and consolidation, but right now it's kind of a dog-eat-dog world out there, and you got to think about who's asking you to complete which survey, which form, which data set, and decide if it's a priority or not.
So Sue says, I understand the consolidation is happening, but what would you recommend to a client in the US since reporting and greenhouse gas accounting are more and more necessary?
I would focus on the basics. And I think the basics for any company is going to be, again, it's sectorally dependent, but most, what most companies are looking for, the data sets that most companies need to include, almost all companies include, they talk about energy and greenhouse gases. They talk about health and safety for employees, particularly if you're in the manufacturing space. They talk about the diversity of your employee base, of your leadership team. It's things like that, some around community engagement, but that's of less interest to the investors, honestly. It's a nice story to tell for your employees and for your communities. But those are the kinds of things that are kind of the basic table stakes that pretty much any framework, any report should talk about. Would be the diversity of the employee demographics. It would be health and safety information. It would be greenhouse gases. Then there's 5 or 10 others that I'm sure someone in here is thinking about and saying, yeah, but what about this? Center of the target, center of the Venn diagram. What are people asking you? Focus on those few things and do them well, and then analyze the rest of them as you're being asked for them to see if it's worth the effort to gather the information for them.
With CSRD, is there any certifying? Is it certifying anything, or is it compliance or?
ESRD is a disclosure framework, which means you're simply being asked to disclose. It's not a performance framework. And so you're not being, you will have a CSRD compliant report that you're a third party, a verifier will verify for you. But it's not a certification saying I am a CSRD certified company. It's not that.
Shay says, I think EcoVadis is one of the most comprehensive certifications, but they require a lot of information to be uploaded as opposed to others that allow you to show an auditor assessor, but not turn over the documentation. This is my greatest reservation about them. What do you hear from other companies about this?
You know, it depends upon the, you know, who's asking you to do it. If you've got big customers who are all saying, hey, we're in the EcoVadis chain, the EcoVadis system, then it's up to you to kind of decide as to whether you want to participate or not. But I agree with you. We do a lot of EcoVadis support, and you know, you are uploading policies, documents. You know, in many of the cases, a lot of times these documents need to be publicly facing anyway. So it's not like you're disclosing, you know, publicly facing if you are a, you know, if you're a publicly traded company. Let me give that caveat. If you're a privately held company, this might be stuff that you're not disclosing before publicly, then it's kind of a business decision for you to make as to whether you're going to participate or not.
I want to allow any members of the Peer Impact Network here for opportunity to ask questions if you have them. Can you hang on for like a couple of minutes longer?
I'm good.
Okay, so ask away. When you, I've noticed biodiversity is coming up a lot this year, and
Yeah, you bet.
again, it's about materiality. It goes back to, like you said, if your business is not material, then you shouldn't be focused on biodiversity, or should you be following all these trends?
You know, it depends who's asking. It depends upon, is it a material issue for you or not? One of the things that we see companies asking themselves or struggling with a lot is that, you know, biodiversity, I mean, we all care about biodiversity. It's a very important issue for the globe. You know, does your business impact it? Does it have an impact on your business? You need to be somewhat clinical in how you assess it. Biodiversity is a hot topic. I mean, you know, the world is a wildly intricate, interconnected system of interlocking processes. And if biodiversity goes sideways and is really impacted, there will be impacts in all kinds of areas that we expect and maybe even don't expect. All that being said, you know, not, you know, every company can't focus with great detail and great energy and great intensity on biodiversity. They don't have the bandwidth to do that. There's probably more pressing kind of directly impactful issues they need to consider. But there's no doubt that biodiversity is becoming an increasingly important issue as people are realizing the global importance that this particular topic has. And you'll see more and more interest in it, where you will be asked to either provide information around it or to be able to justify why you're not going to provide information using the materiality argument to say, you know, here's why we're not monitoring it. It's because, you know, we don't feel, based on this information, we don't feel like we have an impact on it or that it impacts us.
And a final question while people have the chance to think of theirs. How can sustainability professionals stay updated with the latest trends, with all this consolidation and best practices in this rapidly evolving field?
Yeah, it's really hard. You know, I mean, I've got 30 people, you know, working at SustainServe, and we, you know, and we're always just staying on top of them. I mean, we have a whole system in our team of subject matter experts, you know, where people are assigned to be staying on top of a particular area. Very hard for one person to do it. I mean, you know, I mean, if I didn't have a day job, I could sit and just surf the web all day and stay on top of all this stuff, you know, but we all have day jobs. And so, you know, I would, you know, find some centralized good resources. I mean, GreenBiz is actually a media company, and they have a lot of good stuff on their website and a lot of good resources, articles, things like that. But develop, excuse me, develop a kind of a reading list, you know, or a web resource list, you know, that you go and you scan. I mean, what I do is I go and I scan probably a dozen different resources, you know, drinking my coffee or sitting on the couch with a glass of wine on a Friday night. I'll just leaf through them and just see what's hot, what's trending, what are people talking about. You know, it is a fire hose of information that changes every single day. And that's one of the challenges. So I feel your pain, you know, experience it every day. That's the reality of it. So there's a few different strategies you can do, like what I just said, but it's a challenge.
Okay, and one last controversial thing for an ESG reporting consultant. How much involvement do you give the consultant versus doing the reporting in-house? And how is that reflected on the result of the report?
Great question. Can we, my team, and we've done 400 plus reports. There'll be something 450 or something at the end, basically now we've done those over the years. Could we parachute into a company and produce an ESG report? Yeah, we could parachute in and we could produce a very credible thing that captures the right data, that tells the right stories, or tells stories that we think are relevant about the company's sustainability performance, given access to the company, given access to the information. It would not be anywhere near as good as if we have real engagement from the client, and we insist on that engagement. They want it. This is a reporting product. This is a Colgate-Palmolive product. This is a State Street product. This is a Lowe's product, and it needs to reflect the business. And the companies are smart enough to know that. They know that this needs to be kind of a product that they have produced, and so they got to be involved, and they're spending a good bit of money on me or on my team or on another consultancy or another agency to do it, and so they want to get their money's worth out of it. And so we always insist, always have, there's a core client team, and these are people who typically come from either the sustainability, it's probably someone from the sustainability group if they have one. They don't. Many large publicly traded companies do not have a sustainability group. They have one person who has it in their title. Someone from corporate communications, someone who knows how the company likes to present itself and talk about itself. That's essential. Subject matter experts, so people who can talk to DE&I, people who can talk to energy and facilities and the physical infrastructure, people who can talk to supply chain. So we look for a team of subject matter experts reflective of the material issues, back to that topic, to tell that, so that we can then draw upon them and say, hey, is there a good supply chain story from this last year where you've been engaging suppliers to help them drive their greenhouse gas emissions down, for example? And we'll do that as part of the process. And then, one thing here, just, having leadership engaged is essential. Back in the day, 20 years ago, we could do sustainability reports and the CEO, he or she might not even have been aware of it, or might not have known about it until the very end. But leadership needs to be engaged. Corporate communications and/or marketing needs to be engaged. One of the hardest parts, and one of the reasons why I would not want to go into a company and parachute in and just produce a report, turnkey report without their involvement, is that they know how to talk about the company. They know the phrasing. They know the terminology. They know the keywords that they like to use and the words they don't like to use. And so we insist that they're involved early on in the process to provide some guidance in that respect, so that it sounds like a State Street report. So it sounds like a Lowe's report. So it sounds like a Colgate-Palmolive report. That's essential. And we really push to make sure it happens, because I guarantee you, if they're not involved somewhere, the report's 80-90% done, we're ready to button it up and walk out the door, and someone says, hey, this doesn't sound like us, come back. It's that kind of thing we want to avoid. And I think everyone would agree that that's not a good outcome. That's not what you want to have happen. So anyway, so that's, so you can do it with, depending on the size of the organization, the complexity of the organization, you can do it with a fairly lean team, but they've got to have the mandate. Leadership's got to be engaged, and we need to have, the right people at the table in order to come up with a good quality product at the end of the day.
I think I knew your answer. That's why I asked the question.
Right on.
But you're getting a lot of thanks in the comments as well. Thank you for your time and being gracious to stay overtime to answer some questions. Thank you all for attending. And we'll try to keep updating you with the latest and getting more webinars with Matt as they consolidate and more.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Sounds
Matt.
good. Hey,
Thank
thanks
you.
everybody. Take care, y'all. Bye.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much.